Police are looking at a possible new lead in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Oh, hopefully this is going to find her. I don't know. Dan Bowens, what do you know? Could it help crack the case?
Well, we hope so, Rosanna and Jerry. There's been no shortage of tips, tens of thousands, in fact, but investigators say meaningful leads, yeah, they've been hard to come by, even after the family offered that $1 million reward earlier this week. Now, there is a new video that could provide a fresh clue. Let's take a look. The images here obtained by Fox Digital. A Ring doorbell camera about 2 miles from Guthrie's Arizona home captured several cars that were passing through the area that same night. The same night that she disappeared. Investigators say at least 12 vehicles drove by between midnight and 6 a.m. on February 1st, with some seen around 2:30 a.m., right around the time the 84-year-old's pacemaker last synced with her phone. Now, the Pima County Sheriff's Department says it is aware of the video and is taking steps to review it. Unclear if they knew about it before or if it's something they're just now seeing. Maybe they can slow down those images, possibly to get any kind of details from those vehicles as they drive by. Will it lead to something? We'll find out.
At 1:32 a.m., in the shadowed silence of Tucson's Catalina Foothills, a motion sensor flickers to life. An 84-year-old woman is asleep inside a home she has trusted for nearly 40 years. A home where every routine is predictable, every light switch familiar, every night identical to the last. A man walks up to her door. He doesn't knock. He doesn't force his way in. He reaches for the camera, as if he already knows exactly where it is. Hours later, Nancy Guthrie is gone. No struggle. To no witnesses, no body. 2 miles away, in the open desert, a single glove is found, carrying DNA that belongs to a man no one can identify. Inside Nancy's bedroom, a second DNA profile surfaces. 2 unknown men, 1 targeted victim, and a timeline that begins with the last person who saw her alive. Her own son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, standing just outside that circle of family, a man who had been in his life for 19 years, Dominic Evans. This is not just a disappearance, and it is a question of access, of trust, of who knew the house, who understood the routine, and who had nothing to fear from walking straight up to the front door. Because when 2 DNA profiles exist in a crime this controlled, investigators stop asking who was there and start asking who worked together. So tonight, we're not just examining what happened to Nancy Guthrie. We're asking something far more disturbing. Was this the work of a stranger? Or the final act of a plan built quietly, patiently, inside her own trusted circle? Welcome to Crime Pattern Bureau, where every case is reconstructed through evidence, behavior, and the psychology no one else is talking about. If you're new here, this is where we follow the details others overlook and the questions that refuse to go away. So before we go further, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because this case has pulled in viewers from all over the world, and every perspective matters. And as you listen, keep one question in your mind. If the DNA leads to 2 men who already knew each other, what does that say about the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared? Because the answer to that question may change everything. The answer to that question begins hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, when everything still looked ordinary. A late evening settles quietly over the Catalina Foothills, the kind of desert night where sound travels farther than it should, and the air cools just enough to make people believe they are safe. Nancy's street is still. Porch lights glow behind adobe walls. Security signs sit staked into gravel. The neighborhood has the comfortable rhythm of people who have lived there for decades, people who know their neighbors' dogs by name, who recognize the sound of the same cars passing at the same time every day. Nancy had lived here since 1985. The house wasn't just where she slept. It was where her entire life had accumulated. The furniture she never replaced. The framed photographs that hadn't moved in years. the kitchen drawers that opened to the exact place her hands expected them to be in the dark. Routine is a form of security. And Nancy's life was built on routine. At 84, was with a pacemaker regulating the fragile consistency of her heartbeat, her world had become smaller, quieter, more predictable. She went to bed early. She kept the same pathways through her home. She locked what she believed needed to be locked. And most nights ended the same way, with her being dropped off by the person investigators would later say was the last to see her alive. Tommaso Cioni. That detail, on its own, is not suspicious. Families do this for each other every day. But in a case built on timing, access, and familiarity, the last normal moment becomes the most important one. Because whoever planned what happened next knew exactly when Nancy would be alone. They knew the house would be quiet. They knew no one else would be arriving. They knew the night had reached its most vulnerable point. And that kind of knowledge doesn't come from watching a house from the outside. It comes from being part of the life inside it. Earlier that evening, so the drive through Tucson would have felt completely routine. Street lights, the steady hum of traffic thinning toward the foothills, the same turns taken hundreds of times before. Nothing about it would have suggested that investigators would later examine that route minute by minute, mapping the distance between the moment Nancy stepped out of the car and the moment a masked figure appeared at her door. When Nancy entered her home, it was the end of a normal day. But investigators would later ask a question that changes the emotional gravity of that moment. Was it also the beginning of a countdown? Inside the house, everything remained in place. There were no signs of panic. No sign that she expected anyone to return. No indication that she sensed a threat. And that is one of the most psychologically significant details in this entire case. Because Nancy was not taken in chaos. She was taken in silence. Which means whoever came to that door did not trigger the kind of fear that causes someone to run, scream, or fight. They either moved with overwhelming control, or they encountered no resistance at all. That is not the profile of a random intruder. That is the profile of a controlled operation. In the early days of the investigation, law enforcement would describe the disappearance with one word: targeted. Not a burglary gone wrong. Not an opportunistic crime. Targeted. And that word changes everything. Because a targeted crime requires three things: information, preparation, and a reason. And those three things always point back to people, not places. To understand how Nancy became the center of such a calculated act, you have to step outside the house and look at the network of relationships around her. The people who knew her schedule, the people who knew her health condition, the people who knew she lived alone, and the people who had been moving in the same social and geographic circle for nearly 2 decades. This is where another name enters the story, not through the family itself, but through a connection that predates the crime by 19 years. Dominic Evans. To the outside world, Dominic is not part of Nancy's daily life. He is not a relative. He is not someone who appears in the early missing person headlines. But in the architecture of trust that surrounds this case, the proximity is not measured by family titles. It is measured by time. And 19 years is not a casual association. 19 years means shared spaces, shared conversations, shared knowledge. It means being present for the evolution of someone else's life, watching their routines form, their relationships deepen, their environment become familiar. Not as an observer, but as someone inside the circle. Long before Nancy disappeared, long before her name would become a national headline, the two men met in Tucson through something as ordinary as a classified ad. Music brought them together. Rehearsal rooms, small venues, late-night drives between cities. The kind of long-term creative partnership that builds an unspoken understanding, not just of each other's personalities, but of each other's lives. Because musicians don't just share stages, they share stories. They talk about their families, their frustrations, their plans, their financial pressures, their daily routines. And over time, those conversations create a mental map of each other's worlds. So even if someone never spent a single night inside Nancy Guthrie's home, they could still know where it was, who lived there, how often she was alone, what time she went to bed. That is how information travels in long-term relationships. Not through surveillance, through familiarity. In behavioral profiling, there is a concept called indirect access, and it describes a situation where a person never appears to be connected to a victim, but possesses detailed knowledge about them through a trusted intermediary. Indirect access is one of the most difficult connections for investigators to prove, but it is one of the most common in targeted crimes, because it allows a plan to form without ever alerting the person at its center. Nancy never needed to know Dominic Evans for Dominic Evans to know about Nancy. All that was required was 19 years of proximity to the person who did. Back inside the house, the night deepens, the temperature drops, the desert quiet becomes total. And somewhere between the last light turning off and the first motion alert on the security system, the timeline of a normal evening ends. Investigators will later reconstruct those hours with clinical precision. Not because anything obvious happened, but because nothing did. No phone calls, no unexpected visitors, no activity that would suggest Nancy was awake. Which means, when the man approached the house in the early morning hours, he was approaching a situation he already understood. He knew she would be in bed. He knew she would be alone. He knew the neighborhood would be asleep. And perhaps most importantly, he knew how much time he had. There is another psychological element that emerges here, one that rarely gets discussed outside of investigative circles: confidence. And the man on the camera does not move like someone improvising. He moves like someone who has already imagined this moment. He walks directly to the camera. He reaches for it without hesitation. That action, small as it is, tells investigators something critical. You don't search for a camera in the dark unless you already know it's there. And you don't take the risk of disabling it unless you are certain of what happens next. That is not curiosity. That is preparation. A preparation requires rehearsal. And in this case, there is evidence that the house, or at least the approach to it, had been observed before. Not in a way Nancy would notice, not in a way neighbors would remember, but in a way that allowed someone to test timing, to measure response, to learn how long they could remain on that property without triggering attention. That detail shifts the crime from a single event to a sequence, and sequences require planning. As the investigation unfolds, law enforcement will focus on physical evidence: the glove in the desert, the DNA inside the house, the surveillance footage. But beneath those tangible elements lies a psychological question that drives everything forward. Who benefits from this level of control? Not financially, not emotionally, but strategically. Because this crime is not driven by rage. It is driven by logistics. Nancy Guthrie was not a random victim. She was selected. And selection always begins with information. And information about vulnerability. Information about timing. Information about isolation. The kind of information that lives in conversations, in shared histories, in long-term relationships. The kind of information that does not exist in public records. By the time the sun rises over the Catalina Foothills, Nancy is gone. The house is still. the neighborhood wakes up to another normal morning. And for a few hours, the disappearance exists only as an absence. A phone call not returned, a routine interrupted. But the structure of what happened is already in place. 2 DNA profiles, 2 different roles, 1 operation, and a network of people connected by nearly 2 decades of shared history. As investigators begin their work, they are not just looking for a stranger. They are looking for a point where 2 lives intersect. The life of the last person to see Nancy alive, and the life of a man who had been standing beside him for 19 years. Because if those 2 DNA profiles belong to people who already knew each other, then the most important part of this case is not what happened inside the house. It's what happened long before that night. In rehearsal rooms, in conversations, in the slow accumulation of trust and knowledge that turns ordinary relationships into something far more consequential. And that brings us back to the question that now defines this investigation. If this crime required 2 people, when did the plan begin? Because the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared may not be the beginning of this story. It may be the end of it. Because if the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared was the end of the story, then the beginning is buried somewhere in the years no one thought to examine. Long before crime scene tape, before aerial search grids, before the words missing and abduction were ever spoken together, there was a relationship that existed in plain sight. A relationship that, on its surface, had nothing to do with an elderly woman living quietly in the Catalina Foothills. Music, small stages in Tucson, rehearsal spaces that smelled of dust and old wiring, late-night conversations that stretched past midnight because creative partnerships rarely end when the instruments go silent. That's where the connection between Tommaso Cioni and Dominic Evans was built. Not in secrecy, not in the shadows, but in the open. For 19 years. And that is precisely what makes it psychologically significant. Because long-term trust creates something investigators call shared environmental awareness. It means you don't just know a person. You know their life, their frustrations, their financial pressures, their family dynamics, the people they talk about, the routines they repeat. Over time, the boundary between your life and their life begins to blur. And that is how indirect access becomes operational knowledge. Now, by the time Nancy disappeared, this was not a casual friendship. It was infrastructure. 19 years of proximity means that Dominic didn't need to ask where Nancy lived. He didn't need to be introduced to her. He didn't need to conduct surveillance. The information already existed, accumulated slowly through years of conversation, travel, shared projects, and the unguarded honesty that develops between people who believe they know each other completely. And that kind of relationship changes how investigators look at a crime, because it introduces a possibility that is far more complex than a lone offender: division of roles. In behavioral analysis, this is known as the architect-operative model. The architect does not need to be present at the moment the crime occurs. The architect provides the knowledge, the timing, the vulnerabilities, the access points. The operative provides the physical execution, the risk tolerance, the confrontation. And when those 2 roles exist, the crime becomes cleaner, quieter, more controlled, and it becomes exponentially harder to solve. Now consider the physical evidence. 2 separate DNA profiles, one inside the house, one on a glove discarded along what investigators believe may be an escape route. 2 different biological signatures in 2 different locations connected to the same event. This is not an interpretation. It is a forensic reality. And in cases like this, the forensic reality does something that speculation cannot. It forces investigators to ask not who, but how many. The psychology of a 2-person operation is fundamentally different from that of a lone offender. A lone offender is driven by urgency, emotion, or compulsion. A coordinated act requires communication, planning, trust. Trust is the most critical element, because once two people are involved, each becomes a liability to the other, unless their relationship is strong enough to override that risk. Unless their history together has already proven that silence is mutual. 19 years is more than enough time to establish that. There is another factor investigators examine when considering the architect-operative model: skill set. Not talent, not intelligence, experience. Because the man who entered Nancy's house did not behave like someone committing his first crime. He moved with control. He disabled a camera. And he entered and exited without triggering a neighborhood response. He removed a vulnerable victim without leaving behind the kind of chaos that untrained offenders create. That is not improvisation. That is learned behavior. And learned behavior comes from repetition. This is where Dominic Evans becomes psychologically relevant to the structure of the crime. Not as an accusation, but as a profile that fits the role of an operative. See, a history that includes burglary and robbery is not just a record of past mistakes. It is a record of thresholds crossed. Burglary teaches you how to enter spaces that do not belong to you. It teaches movement in darkness, control of sound, awareness of layout, management of adrenaline. Robbery teaches something even more significant. It teaches you how to confront another human being and maintain control of that confrontation. Most people, even under extreme stress, cannot physically overpower another person. They hesitate, they freeze, they panic. Someone who has already crossed that psychological boundary once has a drastically different response to it in the future. They know what it feels like. They know they can do it. That changes everything. Meanwhile, the role of the architect requires something entirely different. Not physical dominance, but intimate knowledge. Knowledge of when Nancy would be alone, how long she would be alone, at which entrances were used, which security measures were active, which ones were not. Those details do not come from criminal experience. They come from proximity to her daily life. And there was only one person publicly known to have that proximity on the night she disappeared. As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, they discovered something else. Something that moves this case even further away from the possibility of a random act. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. The window between Nancy being dropped off and the appearance of the masked figure was long enough for the house to fall into complete stillness. Long enough for lights to go out. Long enough for the neighborhood to settle into sleep. But not so long that anyone would expect another visitor. That is not coincidence. That is coordination. Coordination requires communication. And communication leaves traces. Not always in messages or phone calls. Sometimes in behavior. Sometimes in silence. And in the days after Nancy vanished, something subtle began to happen. Public visibility changed. The rhythm of normal life for the people closest to the investigation shifted. And while there are many innocent reasons for someone to withdraw from public view in the middle of a media storm, behavioral analysts don't just look at the withdrawal itself. They look at who withdraws at the same time, because synchronized silence can be as revealing as synchronized movement. The investigation, meanwhile, was expanding. Search teams moved into the desert. Helicopters scanned the terrain. Cell tower data was quietly being analyzed, not just for the night Nancy disappeared, but for the days leading up to it. Because if there was a rehearsal, if someone had tested the approach, the timing, the response of the neighborhood, then the digital footprint of that rehearsal would exist, unlike the night of the crime, when precautions could be taken. A rehearsal is where offenders make mistakes. And they bring their own phones. They drive their own vehicles. They behave normally because they believe they are invisible. And that is where two people involved in the same operation become vulnerable. Because two devices moving together twice, once before the crime and once during it, create a pattern. And patterns are what close cases. While the forensic work continued, another element of the case began to draw attention. The communications sent to media outlets. Ransom-style messages. Not direct contact with the family. Not a controlled negotiation, but messages that used language suggesting hierarchy. The main individual. Not the kidnapper. Not the man who took her. The main individual. That phrase implies structure. It implies multiple participants. It implies that the sender sees themselves as separate from the person at the center of the act. In behavioral terms, that is the language of someone on the outer edge of a conspiracy. Close enough to know, and not central enough to feel safe. And that brings the psychological focus back to the most unsettling possibility in this case. Not that two people committed the crime, but that more than two people may know what happened. Because once information spreads beyond the core participants, loyalty begins to erode. Fear begins to grow. And the promise of a reward, now reaching into 6 figures, becomes a test. Not of morality, but of self-preservation. Inside the investigative command center, the case had already entered a new phase. This was no longer a search for a missing person. It was a race between silence and science. The DNA profiles were being processed. Family trees were being built. Every relative who had ever submitted genetic information to a public database was now a potential link. And this is where the architect-operative model becomes most dangerous for those involved. Because one person can remain genetically invisible, two people drastically reduce those odds. Every branch of every family tree increases the probability that one of them will lead to a name. And once one name exists, the second is never far behind. But before the DNA results return, before any public identification, before any arrest, there is a final psychological layer to this story. One that explains why a crime like this could happen at all. Control. This was not a chaotic act. It was not driven by sudden emotion, and it was built on the belief that every variable had been accounted for, that the house was understood, that the neighborhood was predictable, that the victim was vulnerable, that the roles were clear, that the plan would hold. Crimes like this are not just about removing a person. They are about demonstrating power over an environment, over time, over other people, over the narrative itself. And for a brief period after Nancy vanished, that control appeared to work. No immediate suspects, no clear direction, no physical trace that pointed directly to a single individual. Just questions. But questions are not static. They evolve. And the most dangerous question now facing whoever was involved is no longer, did anyone see us? It is, who will the DNA identify first? Because when that name emerges, whether it belongs to the architect or the operative, the entire structure collapses. The 19-year relationship stops being background information. It becomes motive for cooperation. The timing stops being coincidence. It becomes coordination. The knowledge stops being familiarity. It becomes access. And that is where the investigation now stands. Between two possibilities. One in which the DNA leads to strangers who had never crossed paths before that night. And one in which it leads back to a relationship that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. And because if those two DNA profiles belong to men who already knew each other, then Nancy Guthrie was never the starting point of this crime. She was the final step. Because every crime built on control carries within it the seed of its own failure. For a time, the plan had worked. No forced confession, no body, no eyewitness who could step forward and say, "I saw his face." Just a vanishing. Just a house that went from warm and lived in to forensic evidence in a matter of hours. And 2 DNA profiles moving through a laboratory system that does not forget. Investigators understand something most people don't. DNA is not a fingerprint. A fingerprint tells you where someone was. DNA tells you who they are. Even if they've never been arrested, even if they've never been in a database, even if they believe their identity exists only in the privacy of their own life. Because modern forensic genealogy doesn't search for the person. It searches for the family. And families are networks. You can change your name. You can change your city. You can disappear into routine. But you cannot change the biological trail left by every relative who has ever mailed a tube of saliva to a public testing company out of curiosity about their ancestry. Inside the lab, the profiles began to resolve. Not into names, not yet, but into percentages, shared centimorgans, fragments of identity that pointed outward into branching family trees, trees that grew wider with every database comparison. This is the moment where control begins to slip away from the offender and into the hands of time. Because forensic genealogy is not fast, it is patient. And patience is something offenders rarely understand. They expect an investigation to fail quickly. They don't prepare for an investigation that grows stronger in silence. While the science moved forward, the psychology began to shift. Not inside the police department. Inside the circle of people who knew, or suspected, what had really happened. Because knowledge is a burden. And shared knowledge is a pressure system. Every news update, every public appeal, every mention of the reward, each one tightening the same invisible vice. Who knows what? Who might talk? Who is already being watched? Behavioral analysts look for a specific moment in crimes involving more than one participant. They call it the fracture point, and it is the moment when loyalty begins to compete with survival. And it does not announce itself. It appears in small changes. A phone that is suddenly replaced. A routine that becomes erratic. A person who stops showing up in the places they always used to be. Not disappearance. Adjustment. Because fear rarely makes someone run. It makes them recalculate. And then there is the media. The messages that had once created the illusion of control now began to work in the opposite direction. Because language can be analyzed, compared, profiled. The phrase, "the main individual," did not fade. It stayed in the public consciousness, discussed, replayed, examined by experts in statement analysis. And every time it was repeated, it reinforced the same conclusion. Whoever wrote it was not speaking as the central actor. They were speaking as someone orbiting the center, someone close enough to see, not close enough to feel safe. That kind of psychological position is unstable. It creates resentment, because the person who carries the greatest risk is not always the person who planned the crime. And when that imbalance exists, the operative begins to feel expendable, while the architect begins to feel exposed. Investigators don't need a confession from both. They only need one. That is the mathematics of conspiracy. Meanwhile, the reconstruction of the night Nancy disappeared had reached a level of precision that no one outside the case could see. On vehicle movements, light patterns in neighboring homes, digital activity windows, even the absence of activity, because absence is data. If a phone that normally pings a tower every few minutes goes silent for a specific period and then returns, that silence becomes a location, a gap, a shadow on the timeline. And when two separate devices create the same shadow, that is no longer coincidence. That is convergence. This is the stage where cases stop being theoretical, but where behavioral models meet physical evidence, where relationships become operational links. And for the first time, the central question begins to change. It is no longer, what happened to Nancy Guthrie? It becomes, which one breaks first? Because breaking does not always mean walking into a police station. Sometimes it means talking to the wrong person, confiding in someone who is not as loyal as expected, returning to a location connected to the crime, keeping an object that should have been destroyed. Offenders do not fail because of the crime. They fail because of what they do afterward. There is another psychological element that now enters the story. Time. The longer Nancy remains missing, the harder it becomes for those responsible to maintain the original narrative in their own minds. Memory shifts. Details blur. What was once a shared, controlled plan becomes two separate internal versions of the same event. And when those versions no longer match, trust collapses. For 19 years, a friendship existed that created proximity, access, and shared knowledge. Now that same length of time, compressed into the months after the disappearance, becomes the most dangerous factor of all. Because history cuts both ways. The architect knows what the operative is capable of. The operative knows what the architect knows. And each understands exactly how much the other could reveal. Outside of this psychological pressure chamber, the public continues to see only fragments, searches, press conferences, the steady increase of a reward. But inside the investigation, the structure is already changing. Names are beginning to appear at the ends of family tree branches. Not public names, not yet, but names that come with addresses, employment records, known associates, past charges, travel history, lives that can be mapped, lives that can be compared against the timeline. And this is the moment where the entire case narrows. Because once a single name aligns with a single DNA profile, every relationship that person has ever had becomes relevant. Every call, every shared project, every year of proximity. 19 years stops being a background detail. It becomes a corridor, a direct path between two biological signatures that were found in two different locations connected to the same crime. If those two names are linked by that history, then the architect-operative model is no longer a theory. It is a structure. But there is one final psychological truth that defines cases like this. Control is addictive. The belief that you executed a perfect crime does not fade. It grows. It becomes a private narrative. We planned it. We did it. We got away with it. And that narrative requires reinforcement, which is why offenders revisit the case. Not physically, but mentally, through news coverage, through online discussions, through the comments section of videos just like this one, watching, measuring, trying to determine how close the investigation really is. And that is where the power shifts completely. Because the same curiosity that keeps the public watching keeps the offenders from looking away. So now we arrive at the point where science, psychology, and time intersect. Two DNA profiles moving toward identification. You're a 19-year relationship that explains access, trust, and division of roles. Communications that suggest hierarchy, behavior that suggests fracture, and a single, unavoidable question that has followed this case from the beginning. Were Dominic Evans and Tommaso Cioni connected to the same plan? Or is the truth even more complex than investigators first imagined? Because there is one possibility more unsettling than all the others. Not that one of them is the architect and the other the operative, but that the roles are not what they appear to be. that the person who seemed closest to the victim is not the planner, but the facilitator. That the person with the criminal past is not the driving force, but the instrument. In complex crimes, perception is often reversed. The visible risk is not always the source of control. And if that is true, then the entire psychological structure of this case shifts again. Because it means the crime was not just planned, it was socially engineered, built inside a relationship, hidden inside normal life, executed by exploiting trust that took nearly 2 decades to form. Which brings us back to Nancy, to the woman whose quiet routine became the center of a forensic and psychological storm. A life that, by all visible measures, was ordinary, predictable, safe. And yet, somewhere within the overlapping circles of other people's histories, routines, and private conversations, she became a target. Not randomly, but specifically. And that is the part of this story that remains unresolved. Because even when the DNA names are revealed, even when arrests are made, even when a courtroom reconstructs the timeline in clinical detail, one question will remain that no forensic science can fully answer. Why her? Was she chosen because she was vulnerable? Because she was known? Because her routine fit a plan that had been forming long before anyone realized? Or was she the final piece in something that began years earlier, in conversations no one thought mattered, in information shared casually, in proximity mistaken for safety? Cases like this do not end with the identification of suspects. They end with the collapse of the illusion that such a crime could only happen in darkness, between strangers, in isolation. Because this case, from the beginning, has been about something far more disturbing. Not a break-in, not an abduction, but the weaponization of familiarity. 2 DNA profiles, one dark secret, and a silence that is running out of time. So now the story waits at its most dangerous point. Between science and confession. Between loyalty and survival. Between the past that created the opportunity and the future that will reveal the truth. And somewhere, whether in a laboratory, an interview room, or the private mind of someone who has not slept through a single night since Nancy vanished, the answer already exists. Not as a theory, not as a profile, but as a name. The only question left is, who will speak first?